Yep, good.
Welcome everyone, welcome along. If you're on the last session, you know who I am. My name is Travis Smith. I'm K-12 Industry Lead for Microsoft Australia. Just before we begin, I would like to, and I should have done this in the last session, have an acknowledgement of country. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people in Melbourne, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which I present from today, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today and all over the country. So my presentation today will be really looking at some of the cognitive science that links stylus-enabled learning, so having the right kind of device in the hands of learners, to educational theory, to educational practice, to teaching and learning strategies. And I'm just going to turn my camera off because I'm going to spend a lot of my time sort of looking down at my screen and inking. So I'll just turn that camera off for you so that you will only be able to see my slides. So some of you won't know that I was a assistant principal of a school for a few years, but before that sort of ran a large one-to-one school program in technology, which was actually the first government school one-to-one program in the world, which kicked off in 1992. And in 2006, we transitioned, which is what, 14 years ago now, we transitioned our students to a one-to-one device, including a stylus. And that was at parents' expense, to be brutally honest, because the parents were paying for it. It was a managed one-to-one program where they bought the device we recommended, but it was a decision that we made, which was a little bit more expensive at the time. So today what I'm going to talk about is some of the research and some of the reasons why we did that. And so one of the things that we talk about often is the idea that there's this device dilemma. I want a tablet because it's thin and it's light and it's easy on and I can just get my stuff really quickly, but I need a PC or a MacBook to do some of the crunchier stuff, to do the true multitasking and to do much of the work that we are required to do when we're using multimodal information. In students' experience, it's actually more complex because I think they still need this thing, which is a workbook. And the workbook is actually the pen and paper stuff, because there's lots of reasons why doing the pen and paper thing is really important for their learning and understanding. So what do we think about this BYOD? Now, I've got some old school devices there just to keep people interested. That one on the bottom right there that's in red is basically the first kind of tablet technology that we put in the hands of kids in 2006. But there's lots of different approaches to sort of rolling out technology for students. So one of the challenges with bring your own device is the worst kind of that, in my opinion, is the bring your own anything. Because really you can't exploit that technology for any sort of deeper learning, because you can't guarantee that every learner has the capability to do this, that, or the other, or to run this bit of software, excuse my dog, or run this app. So there's no way that you can sort of pitch to that student or those students and make sure that you're exploiting their device for the best purpose. So therefore, I always was a big advocate for the idea of a managed one-to-one program where, because device matters so much, where we would basically be able to say, hey, this is the device that we recommend as educators that students use. And this will be the least cool thing you'll hear all day, which is the device actually does matter. And it matters for both learners and it matters for teachers in terms of the ways that they can use it and what they can exploit for teaching and learning. So let's think about thinking for a minute. And I've got a psychology degree, so maybe this is more exciting for me than you. But when we ask students to do thinking, if task difficulty increases, then what people often do is want to shift to multimodal communication. And multimodal communication is the idea of, it's kind of manifests itself in, like, when you see someone sort of say, oh, I just want to, I want to jump out of my seat and go up to the whiteboard and do some presenting. And the reason that that's important is because, I'm just going to bring my video back up, is because your brain gets full to a point where you sort of start to think, I just can't capture all this in a non-digital way. I need to, in a digital way, I need to draw it out and sketch and make connections between the ideas. And so this difficulty, as it increases, we want to switch to more of that. And there's also the idea of keyboards being really not very flexible for the kinds of thinking that we want to do. And so if I just switch across here, here's a screen capture or a photo of a physical whiteboard. And a physical whiteboard is a great example of how thinking sort of comes out of your brain and emerges and occurs, because you can see here what we were trying to do was create a bit of a demo back in the day, and you think that these ideas are going to come straight out of your brain and they're going to come into a nicely organized dot-pointed list. And the reality is they're never quite organized that well. All of these other things happen while you're thinking about it. You can see that there's, this thing happened over here, and this diagram was relevant here, and this one happened over here. And all of those things have sort of come together to be a sort of an example of how human brain thinks. And it's not a linear list of stuff. It's actually a smattering of ideas that are kind of connected in random ways at the start that then eventually you will bring back into some semblance of order. And so there's a lot of research that's been done in this space. And this is a book by Professor Sharon Oviatt. And Professor Sharon Oviatt put together this book based on all of the work that was being done in these areas of science that you can see at the top of that slide. And it's called The Design of Future Educational Interfaces. And basically what it does is thinks, hey, if we were to start again and develop a device from the ground up for the thing called learning, what would it actually afford? What would allow us to do? And when you look across all of those bits of science, there's sort of some commonalities in terms of what happens when we think, the way the human brain works, and how that's a mismatch with many of the devices or the ways that you input stuff into devices, namely keyboards. And so if you want a device which supports thinking and problem solving, which of course we do when we're working with kids, then having a stylus is crucial. Or having an analog way of doing that kind of thinking, whether it be in their workbooks or on paper or on butcher's paper or on a whiteboard or some other way, is really crucial to the thinking process. So we shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. One of the challenges we often see is that people go, oh, I can't really do that on a keyboard, so I just won't do it. The problem is that there's lots of science behind those strategies which do help the thinking. For example, brainstorming is done much better on a pen and paper or a digital pen and paper or a whiteboard than it is on a keyboard. And so if you're brainstorming, and they've done research on this, if you're brainstorming into a Word doc or a Google doc or a whatever, a notes page, an iPad or whatever, students will produce 36% less ideas than if they're doing it with pen and paper. The next phase of a brainstorm is actually to make connections and think, hey, that one's actually related to that one. And those sorts of things are really quite difficult to do when you're working in the sort of digital way that a keyboard-based device only lets us. So let's talk a little bit more about ways that technology can sort of be misapplied, if you like, in the learning process. And so I'm going to talk here about note-taking as an idea. And so this is a piece of research that was done a little while ago by Mueller and Oppenheimer. And the title of the research was "The Pen is Mightier Than the Keyboard." And it talks about the advantages of doing longhand note-taking versus typing. If you go into many of our high schools, especially at senior level, and our tertiary institutions right now, provided classes we're on, they would actually be sitting there behind a keyboard taking notes in a lecture. And there's some real challenges with that, which we'll talk about in the next 5 or 10 minutes. So in this experiment here, there were 3 experimental conditions, or 3 groups that they looked at. The first group were told, so everyone was in a sort of big lecture theatre and everyone was taught by the same teacher. And basically the first group were told, you guys take notes on a keyboard. So laptop, just use your laptop. It doesn't matter if it's physical or on-screen keyboard, it has the same impact. So you take notes on a keyboard. Another group in the middle were told, you take notes longhand, and that means pen and paper or digital pen and paper. And the third group were told, you take notes on a keyboard, but I'm going to give you a hint that I didn't give the first group. And that hint is, don't take verbatim notes. Try not to type down everything that is being said. Because the research shows that people are fast enough typists these days, even if you're not a touch typist, fast enough at typing these days to almost transcribe exactly what was being spoken about by the teacher, exactly what was being spoken about, full stop, next line. And what they end up with is basically a transcription of most of the content just written in their notes. And so that's why they sort of said, hey, let's have one group do it with a keyboard, take these notes down, and the second group who use a keyboard will give them that hint to not sort of transcribe everything, because that tends to be what people do. So let's have a look at what they assessed. They were assessing the idea of factual recall, which we realise is something that is important. It's less cool, but it's still important for education. How many facts can you remember out of this, or how well can you remember those facts? On the right-hand side there, you can see conceptual application, which is basically the idea of how can we test whether or not they can apply these concepts they've learned to a new setting. And of course, that's a much more powerful way to test deep learning. So they assess both of those things. So let's have a look at the results based on the experimental conditions. So the group who used a laptop only to take notes had a decreased ability to recall facts and a decreased ability to apply those learned concepts to a new setting. And that's a real challenge. Basically what it does is it speaks to the idea that they haven't been able to recall the facts so much, probably because they haven't processed it, they've just been transcribing it. So they haven't actually thought about the ideas in any way, shape or form, they've just got it down. If you compare that with the group who were taking longhand notes, that is the ability to write either on screen or just on pen and paper, increased factual recall, and much increased conceptual application. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One of the reasons for that, I think, is the idea that when you are writing things down by hand, you obviously can't go as fast. And so if you can't go as fast, many of us have been in lecture theatres ourselves as a student, or some of us have taught in tertiary as well, or do teach in tertiary. You often hear that audible groan from students as you move to the next PowerPoint slide before they've got everything down. You know, I haven't got it down. And basically what that says is you shouldn't actually be writing all of this stuff down. You know, you're going to get the slides later. You should be synthesizing, thinking, summarizing, drawing the diagram, getting the key graph down, annotating stuff. That's what you should do in good note-taking practice. And often what we don't have is the ability to do that if we're using a keyboard-only device. If you're taking notes on a keyboard, I would hazard a guess that none of you have ever tried to draw a diagram. And what that says is that these diagrams aren't as important as the written word when I'm doing learning, which we know is not true, because often we use diagrams to convey, you know, a picture worth 1,000 words. So the ability to slow people's brains down, to make them do summarizing, dot pointing, annotating, drawing, capturing little graphs and diagrams is really the reason why we have huge amounts of recall, improvements in recall of facts, and much better conceptual application. The reason is because you've processed it once on the way into your brain, which means that there's more neural connections, which allows you to get that information back up. The third condition here were the ones who were told, use a keyboard, but we don't want you to take verbatim notes. So they did have a slight improvement in factual recall, much improved versus the ones who used the keyboard who weren't given that hint, but still the conceptual application was pretty poor. And that speaks to the cognitive science going on in the human brain when you do note-taking in that way. And so this really talks to a couple of things. Either you've got the wrong technology in your hand when you're taking notes, or you're misapplying technology to a task that it shouldn't be used for as much. And so that's one of the reasons I'm really passionate about the idea of stylus-enabled learning, and I've been talking about this for a long time. Here's an example of a friend of mine's notes who was studying medicine in Adelaide. And he was a very studious guy, wanted to do really well, and he's now a doctor in a hospital as a result of his studies. But what you can see here, there's a lot of theory behind what's going on here. The first thing I'll say is that when he sat in his lectures, he would use his OneNote page, which didn't look like this. It was just handwritten notes and scribbled diagrams and whatever. So his first cut of notes live were a handwritten version on his tablet PC of what he was learning in the lecture. Then he would get the lecturer's slides afterwards from the professor, and you can see here that there's a ECG or something that is in the background of his notes here. And he grabbed that off a professor's slide at a later date, put it in his notes, read through his handwritten notes, and then made connections between, now he's got the actual high fidelity content, we would call that. That's the high fidelity content, the structured stuff, the screenshots, the grabs, the documents, things that are fixed, what Professor Gordon Sanson would describe as high fidelity content. He would grab that, and then he would put all of the low fidelity content around it, which is all of this stuff here. But also, if I just zoom in on this diagram, all of these little things which I'm highlighting in yellow here, all of these little markings that he's making, these things that he's doing here, are all called non-linguistic visuospatial markings. And what they are, and that's what they talk about in the research, what they are is basically evidence of the way that he is connecting ideas, demonstrating understanding, thinking about what does that actually mean, how does that relate to this. He's got some stuff sort of popping out the side. You know, he's got a something's here which is an ST depression here that means something. So you can see he's got high lateral labeled here. There's this. This becomes the place upon which he learns and makes sense of what he's doing. And the best way to do learning is actually, according to Professor Gordon Sanson, is to have this perfect combination of high fidelity, high structured stuff like the screenshot and the low fidelity ink-based stuff that you use to make meaning of it. And so that's an example of someone who was doing higher education learning. Let's talk a little bit more about K-12. This could be higher ed as well. Let's talk about e-textbooks. E-textbooks are great, right? E-textbooks are much better than probably the textbooks I learned from when I was at school, because I certainly didn't have the ability to rotate things around, to watch little videos in situ in amongst my text, to link out to sort of interactive things. So e-textbooks are great. But there is a challenge with e-textbooks, and that is that it's really hard to note take on them. I used to teach Year 12 psychology, and did so for about 10 years. And one of the things I used to say to my Year 12s at the start of their Year 12 psychology course was, you won't be selling your textbook at the end of this year because we're going to write all over it. And the reason that we were writing all over it is because I wanted that to be a memory aid for how the activities we did in class linked to the theories that they were learning. And so they had a physical textbook, and in there were scribbles in the margins, highlights, underlines. Sometimes we would do experiments with the kids. I didn't tell them why we were doing it. We'd run an experiment, and then I'd say, right, page 252, first 3 paragraphs, read it, 5 minutes in silence. You start writing down why you think we did that experiment and how it links to that bit of theory. And they would do that literally in their textbook. And the reason they did that in their textbook was because I wanted them to have visual reminders. If we think about the memory system and the way it works, by doing the experiment, you end up with what's called an episodic memory. And an episodic memory is the strongest type of memory. It's something you experienced, right? So they have an episodic memory. Semantic memories are hard. Semantic are meaning-based memories, and that's what a textbook is. That's what the text is in a textbook or on a website or wherever they're learning from, something they read. And so semantic is about meaning memories and the episodes. And I wanted them to connect those two things together. So the best way to do that was to put the example of the episodic memory and link it to the theory. So when they got into the exam, hopefully they would access both the semantic memory and they could remember what it was about with the episodic memory. And so it's kind of using the power of the human brain to help them study more effectively. Now, how does this relate to e-textbooks? E-textbooks are wonderful. They allow us to do lots of stuff. But the reality is, it's more powerful when you can leverage stuff from an e-textbook and put it on some paper and then allow you to build meaning and understanding on top of it. So you can see here that with the click, I'm using a surface here, so I've got my double click on my pen, which will automatically take a screenshot, grab a screenshot of that brain, whack it in my OneNote page, and now I can do all of this annotating, marking up, even audio recordings of my understanding on top of that. Because the challenge with traditional e-textbooks and those who use physical paper, so an actual physical book to write down stuff or a lever arch folder or something, is that the e-textbook is where all of your ideas are, where all of the content you're learning from is. How do I leverage that stuff and get it into my notes? And so what we used to do before technology was teachers would go to the photocopying machine and bash out 30 copies of a piece of paper and get kids to cut it out with scissors and stick it in their book, and then they might do some annotation around it. But when you've sort of got e-textbooks sitting over here and physical paper sitting over here, the two don't often join. And that's a real problem for the way the human brain works. When you annotate on top of things while you're learning about them, the research shows you have an increased depth of processing, an increased reflection on meaning, and an increased memory performance overall. And so the ability to be able to write on top of stuff is crucial. I've always said that a textbook should be a place you learn on, not from. And the reason is what I described with my Year 12s earlier. So let's have a look at another piece of research which kind of talks to this idea. And this is a non-technology based piece of research that was conducted. Let's say everyone in our room is given these two pieces of paper, number 1 and number 2. And you're asked to solve a science problem while you're using those two pieces of paper. So it's a scientific challenge. They've got to do a problem-solving task. They've got their artifacts there in the two bits of paper. The only difference is that half of the room, you tell you're not allowed to write on it while you think about it. And the other half of the room, pick up your grey lead pencils or whatever, and you're allowed to annotate these things while you think about it. The question is, who will perform better? And I think it's pretty obvious that the group who are able to annotate and write and mark up on top of something while they think about it would perform better. As a matter of fact, in this experiment, those who were able to annotate and mark up on top of things performed 24.5% better than those who weren't. And so this gets us to reflect on traditional classrooms without a pen, but with technology. So if you've got a keyboard-only based device sitting in front of a learner, the question is, how do you get them to do that? I taught in a one-to-one classroom for about 12 years, and I reckon where every kid had a computer. And I reckon 95% or more of the resources I gave them for learning were digital. Here's a PDF, open this Word doc, go to the portal and download this, go to the internet and get that, watch this video, here's your e-textbook. All that stuff was coming at them in a digital format. Now, if you don't have a device which allows you to do the writing on top of it, it's very separate from where you do your thinking on top of things. As a matter of fact, you often don't do thinking on top of things. So while we're in a technology-rich world where most of the assets that we're giving kids these days in a one-to-one classroom are very digital, we need to make sure that they can annotate, mark up, and write on top of it because of what the research shows us in this area. And so if you think about these subjects here, mathematics, science, physics, chemistry, music theory, Japanese, Chinese, and art. There are some similarities between all these subjects, which you sort of may not have thought about before. But the similarity is that every one of these has a symbolic language. Every one of these subjects has a symbolic language. And to be honest, they're not very well taught through a keyboard. And so therefore, it's likely that, mathematics, for example, that teachers go, oh, I can't really use the technology that well. We use it for simulations and some bits and pieces, but really they need to be doing drill and practice on paper. And the math teachers are right there, because one of the things about mathematics is that if you become an engineer and you use a lot of mathematics, you're eventually not going to crunch numbers on paper. Everyone gets it. They're going to use big software programs. A lot of it's going to be done automatically. They might be using Excel spreadsheets. They'll use pretty cool software to get that done. But this isn't about being an engineer yet. This is about learning in schools, and it's about forming understanding of mathematical concepts, mathematical symbols, and mathematical processes. And therefore, the drill and practice stuff is really important. And as a matter of fact, so is the writing of equations. So the writing out of equations and the going down and filling those in is an important formational factor in learning mathematics. And so in a traditional mathematics classroom with a keyboard-only based device, that's very, very difficult to do. I'm going to show you some examples of what this looks like in a stylus-enabled classroom later on. Something more profound than this is that all of these things, problem solving, hypothesizing, conceptualizing, and diagramming, are also ill-suited to a keyboard. Obviously, diagramming is a challenge, but actual problem solving is not associated very well with high performance when you do it on a keyboard, nor is hypothesizing, 36% less ideas, nor is conceptualizing and joining connections between information, not very well done on a keyboard. So if you don't have a device that has a stylus in it, then there's a couple of ways you can go. One, think about how you might enable that for students, or two, think about which which techniques in teaching and learning should we be doing still in the old school on paper thing rather than not do it all? Because there's lots of research behind these good practices and that we shouldn't stop doing them just because our device doesn't afford us to do it. So when we think about a list of, we could brainstorm in the chat here 100 different ideas other than what I've got on this bit of paper here. But when you think about device choice for students and for learners, we sort of think about, well, what do students actually do when learning? What are the activities they do during learning? And you can see here a list. They read for understanding, they underline and mark up stuff, they write, they research, they sketch, they take photos, they gather data, they blah, 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 blah. We could do 100 more of those. Everything that's in yellow, there is evidence to suggest is done better with a stylus or pen than a keyboard. And so when you look down that list and you have a look at all of those things that we do every day as learners, or that learners do every day, there's an awful lot of them which are actually better done if you have a device with a pen or a stylus in it, like I'm using today. And so let's just jump a little bit to teaching, because you might think, oh, this has all been about learning so far, or what about me as a teacher? So let me illustrate this with an example from Monash University a few years ago. Monash Uni were doing a piece of research back in the day, and you can see where the timeline was. In early 2000s, they did this, where they were sort of like, when people go to lectures, what happens to their engagement? Are they engaged throughout a whole lecture? Are they not engaged? And also, what are the results associated with actually going to a lecture? So it was kind of when the first remote teaching and learning, video recording lectures back in the day was sort of kicking off. They were reflecting on it. And there were many findings in this research of what it was that sort of led to a decrease over time in engagement and results associated with going to a lecture. But there were a couple of interesting findings here. This was about the time when lecturers shifted their teaching method to keynotes and PowerPoints. Now, some of you will have been to university back in the day before they had PowerPoint or keynotes in lectures. And often what they would do was that scrolling blackboard thing or a whiteboard or even an overhead transparency that they wrote on and it came up projected, or a document camera that it came up and be projected on the screen. There's a few things about this, and I'm not dissing PowerPoint because PowerPoint's a fantastic tool when used properly. But they found this decline was in some part associated with that. So Monash Uni sort of said, how can we get this to go back up? And one of the things they did was they said to lecturers, we'll give you a device with a stylus in it, but we want you to take 60% of the stuff off your slides and ink it in live. So you might have a complete PowerPoint slide. I could have created this as a complete PowerPoint slide and animated the line coming in and all sorts of fanciness. But in actual fact, it's better for me to ink this in and take you on the journey of the building of that story. Because we do know that the history of education and the history of teaching is storytelling. And great teachers are great storytellers. They're thinking about what the students already know, they're linking it to the next idea we want to get to, and they're taking the students on a journey of how these two things together or how that idea evolves over time. This stylus is a great storytelling device. My keyboard, not so much. My keyboard was designed for us to get stuff into a computer fast, but it's not a great storytelling tool. And so while I use a keyboard for many, 80% of the day, having the stylus allows me to sort of do things like creative thinking, like problem solving, like reading for understanding, all those things that we saw in that previous list of yellow items. I grab my stylus out and do it. What did the students say about this approach when they gave these lecturers a device with a stylus and told them to take 60% of the stuff off their slides? 80 to 90% of the students preferred it when their lecturers used this technique. 80% of students said that they were more focused when their teacher did inking over the top of their slides. And 85% said that teachers annotating on top of slides helped them with their understanding of concepts. The lesson here is that if teachers have a device with a stylus, they should absolutely be inking over the top of content while they teach it. And there's some reasons for that, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. So there's an example of a teacher associate Professor Sylvia Urban at RMIT, who started to explore this a couple of years ago. She is a applied chemistry lecturer, and she's a very well credentialed lecturer, associate professor, done a lot of really great work in the space, written textbooks and many papers, etc., etc. And so here's her setup that she shifted to. She stands in front of her classroom there. You can see her. She's got a Surface Pro, in that case, wirelessly projecting to the screen. She could walk around and interact with them. Doesn't matter where she is. She can be untethered from the front desk. And everything she is writing is going up here into a OneNote notebook. That OneNote notebook is sitting in the cloud. The students have their devices, whether it's even a phone or an iPad, or if they've got a full-blown computer, Mac or PC or whatever, they can then see her notes live coming into their own notes on their device. And she would walk around and teach them. The reality is that if you're going to pay $20,000, $30,000, I don't know how much it is these days, to go to Sylvia Urban's classes to hear her, teach you chemistry, you want to see her think like a chemist. And so what you can see here is her actually doing chemistry. And so they get to see what a professional scientist and researcher in chemistry does and how they think. And that can't be underestimated as the impact on them as learners. And so did it actually work? She taught the same course for 10 years. And this was the year where they just switched their static PowerPoints or overhead transparencies into a digital environment, and she started using this fluent inking across the top of her content. These things down here, if you're not in tertiary education, won't mean much to you, but GTS is the general teaching score, which is a rating by students of how good you were as a teacher. And the overall satisfaction index is the OSI, which is the degree to which I think this class is preparing me for my future work in chemistry in this instance. She had the highest results in 10 years as a result of changing it. It was really interesting, this idea of inking over the top of stuff, because I presented at a school once a few years ago about this technique. And the principal jumped up to thank me at the end on stage, and he said, one of the other interesting things I like about teachers taking 60% of the stuff off their PowerPoint slides and inking in live is that the teachers have to be present in the class. And it wasn't a criticism of teachers, it was an acknowledgement of the fact that if you've been teaching content for a while, you can do it on autopilot. If you have a half-baked slide and you have to then go in and ink on top of it and draw that graph and connect the ideas all together, and your brain is actually active while you're teaching it, then the kids are going to have a better experience and probably have deeper learning as a result. So interesting to see the impact of that. So let me actually jump to a couple of demos for you. So actually, let me just give you a bit of a look under the hood here of what I've actually been doing. This is just a big OneNote page I've been presenting from. And so you've seen all of that content above, because I've just been sort of dragging my way around a big OneNote page. And I've been using this double arrow you can see up here in the top right-hand side of my screen to go full screen and get rid of all the menus. So it just looks like a big canvas. Looks like a Prezi or something. It's just a big OneNote page where I've grabbed screenshots from presentations and copied and pasted stuff and written stuff and joined them together with little lines so I know where I'm going. But it's really just a tour of some stuff that's on a OneNote page. Let me show you some other bits and pieces. So here is a piece of mathematics work. And one thing we know is that dotted line that you can see there is really just a PDF worksheet. And so that PDF worksheet is basically just sitting there, and it is a A4 piece of paper where, the mathematics would go down, and in this case, there's some maths gone out the side and there's maths that's gone down. The reality is, what happens if you can see a mistake here as a teacher? How do we give them feedback? And so one of the things you might do is be able to go to something like YouTube and grab a video and use that bit of video as evidence of what they might need to fix. So I'm just dragging in a browser window here. No surprise, it's just a YouTube video. I've done a search for volume of a cylinder, and I want to grab this video here. It's got an ad at the start of it, but it doesn't matter because when I paste it into OneNote, that ad's going to disappear.
Writing's not that easy.
So I'll just pause that. I'm just going to grab the link from the top of my slide from the top of YouTube, and I'm going to minimize that out of the way. And I want this student to watch it. So I'm just literally going to paste that YouTube link into my piece of paper on the right-hand side here. And I'm going to say, hey, you need to go back and have a look at this video. Now that video will actually play in situ live in the piece of paper. Now that is a live YouTube video.
In this example, we're asked to find the volume of the given cylinder. To find the area of a circle is pi times radius.
And they can pause and stop and start. And they can also take some notes down here to improve their understanding. So that's really interesting. Now, let me jump back into science mode for a second. The reason that's important, that you have now a piece of digital paper with the original worksheet, the ability to show all the working and thinking, and the ability for me to give rich feedback in the form of a video that requires the next step of learning. The reason that's important to happen on one piece of paper is because of something called cognitive load theory. And cognitive load theory describes the amount of mental effort that students put into or learners put into jumping around to different windows, running the software. You know, if I had sent a hyperlink there, then suddenly the student has to go and it opens up in a browser, and Facebook happens to be also open there, so they might get distracted. And then they've got their math stuff happening over there. They're watching this video. They've got their OneNote over here. They're writing on. It's just one step worse than having it in the same spot. And so the benefit of digital pieces of paper is they're kind of paper on steroids, right? I can write in here, I can type in here, I can sketch in here and diagram in here, I can put video in, I can record audio in, I can do amazing things in a digital piece of paper. And so another thing that we can do in mathematics is we can actually embed in Microsoft Forms. And so if I go into Forms, I can actually have it automatically generate, to be honest, using the maths tool, which is up here in OneNote, which I don't have time to show you today. But a maths equation, it can automatically detect. It'll actually, why don't I show you? So here's my equation. I'm just going to circle that with my stylus here. Whoops. Circle that whole thing with my stylus and go to the math tool. And this is, and you can see here it's got something wrong here because of my funky looking X. So if I go fix it, I can basically say I can switch it to into math, or I could just go back here and go, yeah, okay, stop that. Correct this by putting it actually as one of these. Oops, one of these X's. Oops, I'm not on my pen. Okay. So I can highlight that again, go to maths, and now it's got it right. You'll notice that I can go, well, what do I want to do? Oh, I want to plot this on both sides in 2D. Oh, look, I've got a graph there. I can insert that graph onto the page. It'll allow me now to manipulate that and make it bigger and smaller. What about if I want to solve it for X? I can. Here's what if I want to show the steps. Now I'm a sadist, so I'm going to use a quadratic formula. Notice how Learning Tools is in here too for the emerging readers or the students with dyslexia. But I can basically grab all that working, chuck it on the page. The other thing I can do down the bottom here, and you can see it down there, is I can actually generate a live practice quiz. And so the live practice quiz is basically going to open up Forms and say, I can see what kind of question you're talking about here. Why don't I generate a whole practice quiz in Forms automatically, whack it on the page so students can do more of these. And so you can see that live over here. I'm just going to close the math tool down. And so as I scroll through, these are all practice questions of a similar technique. The nice thing about this though is the student can use this bit of paper here to show their working for question number 1, choose the right answer, which, there we go, and go to number 2, and choose the right and do their working, and when go back up and go, oh yes, that was the answer that I got, and so on and so forth. And at the end, they can submit their form. So once again, it's happening in the same bit of paper. They've got their learning about the mathematical techniques. They've got a practice quiz happening in the same piece of paper. You can see they're working as a teacher because all of these digital pieces of paper are sitting in a OneNote class notebook, which allows them to all synchronize to you. So that's another example of mathematics with a few different bits and pieces in it. Last thing I'll show you is the old chestnut of giving feedback on an essay or a science report or anything you can put into a OneNote page. And so if I go up to the top of my OneNote and I go insert record audio, it will now plonk in an audio file and it will start to basically be recording my voice. And I'm going to say, you know, thanks, Luke, for getting this in on time. Brilliant work. You've got 2 headings here. I don't know why you've got 2 headings. Anyway, fix that up. I'm sure you know that's a mistake. By the way, I love this paragraph. It's a really strong start. It gets right to the point, yada, yada, yada. The question mark I have is the linkage between these 2 paragraphs, though, because they don't seem to work. On Tuesday in class, we looked at 3 examples of writing. I want you to go back and look at example 2, because you've made the same mistake that we talked about in example 2. And so now what happens is my feedback becomes teaching again. And I can do that. Oh, I better stop that recording. And so I go on and do the rest of the marking. And now what happens is that the student can either listen to this entire audio, or they can actually see how there's little play buttons appearing as I hover over some of this ink. So if I go down here, there's little play buttons. And if I press that little play button, I'm not sure how you'll be able to hear it, it'll go back 5 seconds in the audio, and then it will play through and show the bits of feedback. I'm not quite sure if you can hear that or not, but the audio will actually play out loud with me speaking and show them what I was inking at the time. There's amazing ways that we can start using this kind of technology for creating or giving feedback to learners. So I'm just going to go back into full screen mode. I'm just in a different piece of paper here, and I just want to bring this home by talking about a couple of other things. One of the things that you've noticed I've been doing is that I've been focusing your attention on what I want to talk about by circling stuff as I go. You do it all the time in normal teaching. It's called double accessing information. It's called signposting. We talk about the idea of making sure that students are aware of where you're up to. And so for some reason I've lost my U and the S there. Focus student attention on specific things. And so once I'm talking about that, I mean, distraction recovery for me is a really important aspect of this. Every student and every learner, including us as adults, gets distracted during a session like this. And when I come back and go, oh, right, I'm back, then I want to know what the teacher is talking about. And so that's why I often rub things out and then circle the next thing as I move on to the next point. And it allows for that distraction recovery. Teaching in this mode also allows for the ability to do spontaneous examples of things. You know, I've got all this paper over here, so why don't I just explain the concept right here that you're asking a question about. It allows you to have sort of flexibility, and mostly it allows you to sort of reharness storytelling. The other thing I would say is that also what this guy is doing in front of his blackboard there might actually be the best way to teach those concepts. It could well be that explaining this that way is actually the best way to teach it, not in any other way. And so you can do all the old school diagramming, what you do on a whiteboard, on a digital whiteboard, on a blackboard in the old days. You can do all that stuff on digital paper, but it has some other benefits of being able to add other content in it and making sure that it's a rich experience. I'm going to try and answer a couple of questions in the last few minutes, but my whole premise around this is that what we need to do is make sure that when we are choosing devices for learners, now whether it's a Surface, whether it's a HP or a Dell, Lenovo or whatever else, we need to really choose a no compromise device for uncompromised learning, because there are some real benefits to having a stylus in a full computer, which allows you to do all the richness of multitasking, all the richness of full software, all the richness of apps, all your ETextbooks. Everything can be brought into a central notebook for students to work on. The other advantage is, of course, that a OneNote class notebook with all of the students' sections will actually sit within your team and is part of a class team that you set up straight out of the box. So with that, I'm going to have a look at a couple of questions. Yes, Chris, we do have information on supporting documentation around BYOD. We actually have some guides on that. So if you go to the Microsoft Education website, you should find some white papers and things around BYOD. We wrote a white paper a few years ago. There was a gentleman called Bruce Dixon, who's kind of like the father of one-to-one learning globally, but he lives here in Victoria in Australia. And he had a 21 steps framework, and this is to roll out devices in student learning programs. And the 20th step was to roll out the devices, give the devices to the students. So there were all of these other steps that had to happen first. And so we distilled that down into 5 phases of one-to-one. That white paper is still available on our website, or you can hit us up in the email address or on social, and we'll make sure that you get a copy of that. All of these trainings, including this recording of this session and all the others, will be on the YouTube channel that we have developed, and I'll put that in the link. Just want to answer this other question. Thinking about using this in the classroom, interactive whiteboards, better design, connecting, responding to technologies. Yeah, it's interesting around interactive whiteboards. When we started rolling out tablet-based, stylus-based devices in the classroom, we actually didn't roll out interactive whiteboards. And the reason is that I've got an interactive whiteboard in my hands. And because if I can present this to a whiteboard, then I can actually face my students and do everything I could do on there by facing my students or walking around and teaching from the back of the classroom behind that student who needs a little extra supervision. But I can also be annotating, marking up, using my full computer, writing on stuff and teaching from wherever I am in the classroom if I'm wirelessly connected. So we actually skipped the whole interactive whiteboard thing at the school I taught at, and just went for wireless data projectors, which allowed us to present our screens into sessions. So I'm going to put the link to the YouTube in here. And with that, I will thank you for coming along. Oops, I've lost my slide there. Thank you for coming along to the session today. If you hang around for a second, I will just pop the YouTube link channel in where all of the presentations, not only of this one, but all of the others will be. But also, we'll be sending you an email at the end of the whole event to say, hey, here's all of the recordings from every session that you either could come to or that you missed out on and you want to have a look at. So with that, thank you very much for your time. Hopefully that was useful for you. And don't forget, your next session, if you're joining one, starts at the top of the hour. Thanks, everyone.
I've already popped that link in, Trav. If you can hear me. No, you can't hear me.
Thank you.
That's okay. Oh, you can hear me?
Thanks,
okay.
everyone. Bye.
Oh. Can you hear me, Trav?